let's start now. Very warm welcome to all of you joining in here for this second session in our conference on public participation for ecosystem services. My name is Claudia Bieling. I'm the one who will lead you through today's session here. I'm based at University of Hohenheim in Germany. I'm a professor there for societal transition and agriculture at the Faculty of Agricultural Sciences. My chair is collaborating since almost 4 years now with the Acopian Center for the environment of the American University of Armenia. So I'm very happy about this collaboration with German-Armenian and all his team members here. We are collaborating in the course of a project which comes with a short title, GATES, and a terribly long title as well. So GATES stands for the German-Armenian Partnership on the Advancement of Public Participation, GIS, for ecosystem services as a means for biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. So you see, we tried to pack a lot into this project. So the activities revolve around benefits of nature for human well-being, land management, and most importantly, also participation of local communities in land management. And also we are touching upon the technological possibilities for increasing and uptaking participation and perspectives of local actors. In the course of this project, and we are coming to the end of this project now in this year, and this conference is also the concluding part of the project, we had many different outputs. So it was mostly about exchanging staff and students. So there was a lot of capacity building also in the course of projects. And the very concrete output we are now having is, for instance, some e-modules on ecosystem services related topics. We are also having a video. Yesterday, the ones who have been around yesterday have seen short sections of this video on wild plant harvest in Armenia. We also have several master's theses completed. These are available if you should be interested. So networking and capacity building, that was what we did in the course of this project. And also, this conference is an attempt to bring together all of the different experiences and insights we got through the GATES project. Yesterday, we focused on policy in the context of ecosystem services and integrated land management. And the topic for today, for this session here precisely, is now to think a little bit more about research. So what role can research play in integrated landscape management? In how far is it possible to also achieve a real impact through research? We are very happy for this to have Jörn Fischer, our keynote speaker, with us, who will share some insights, some experiences he made as a person being very active in that field as well. And after Jörn's keynote, we will look forward to having 4 panelists with us who will also share experiences, particularly from the Armenian context, on research and impact in the broad field of integrated landscape management. Before we jump into Jörn's keynote and also then later on in the discussion, 2 technical announcements. So the one thing is that we have translation service available. So in case you are not familiar with Zoom, if you go to the bottom, you will find a button there, and then you can select if you want to follow our session in English or in Armenian. So that should be doable. In case it's not working, please let us know through the chat and we will try to figure it out. So that's the one technical remark. And the other technical remark is, if you have questions, if you want to share something, please do it. Be very active. Don't be shy. We have the chat for this. We will have an eye on the chat and we'll take up your questions. So please be active and contribute. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jörn Fischer, Professor Dr. Jörn Fischer, and spend a few words on his background, what he's doing and why we invited him, and think he's a perfect speaker for our session today. Jörn grew up in Germany, but then went away and completed almost all of his university education in Australia. He got trained as an ecologist, and his interests focus on biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity conservation not so much in areas which would not be influenced by humans, but precisely areas which have some kind of human influence, and where it's always the question of how to bring together human activities and the efforts towards biodiversity conservation. Jörn is since more than 10 years now based at Leuphana University Lüneburg in northern Germany, and he is a professor there for sustainable landscapes. He is particularly interested in interdisciplinary approaches, so bringing together his background in ecology and with fields such as the social sciences in order to make contributions to sustainability research. His research is very solutions oriented, so which means he places a lot of emphasis on real world problems. His overall aim is to make a contribution to helping people to rethink how sustainability problems are framed and can be addressed. He is active in a multitude of different projects, among others, just to mention a few ones, on human carnivore conflicts, or he is having a very recent project on coffee landscapes of Ethiopia in Africa. But the reason why we invited him and think he would be really a perfect speaker here for this audience is that he was involved in a longer project on sustainable landscape development in Romania. And I think he will mainly share experiences from this project on sustainable landscape management in Romania here today. And he will also explain more on why and how they adopted a socio-ecological approach in the course of this project. So Jörn, we are very curious to hear more about that. The floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. So you should be able to see my slides now. Can I just get a vague nod? Yes, thank you.
Yes, we are.
It's very nice to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward only a tiny bit to my presentation, but mostly to the discussion that will follow and to actually having an exchange with you guys about whether there are any interesting parallels going on between the things I will be talking about and the kinds of challenges that you're facing in the landscapes where you work. So I'm really looking forward to that exchange later on. And well, for now, let's get a bit of an intro in terms of what I work on, what we did work on, as Claudia explained, mostly in Romania, and I'll give a bit of context for elsewhere as well. The title being a social ecological approach to understanding landscape change, and that really is what I'm primarily interested in. So many of us, I guess, are interested in some sort of sustainable development. We know that things need to advance in some kind of way from a social perspective, but we also are aware that we need to not destroy the environment in the process. I still like the good old definition of sustainable development, one of the first ones around from the Brundtland report, sustainable development being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to also meet their own needs. What I want to do in the next 40 or so minutes is talk about why we need sustainability science, why I like to focus on the landscape scale in my work. I like the landscape as a scale at which to work rather than, say, the national scale or international analyses and so on. So I'll explain a bit why. And then I want to spend most of the time of this presentation outlining research that we did in Transylvania and central Romania, where we worked for 5 years on a range of related issues about biodiversity, social change, and interrelationships between those two things. And that will be the basis then, I think, for me being able to participate in discussion with you about landscape change and the kinds of challenges you face in your region. A bit of background, why do we need all this? Well, essentially, this is what's been going on over the last 200 or so years, 200, 300 years, what's mapped here. World population has grown exponentially, economic activity has grown exponentially, fertilizer consumption has grown exponentially, as has the amount of telecommunications, water use, large dams, paper production, and so on, all kinds of social phenomena. Our consumption patterns are basically rising exponentially. And that has taken a heavy toll on natural systems. We know, of course, now with climate change being talked about, that carbon dioxide has risen rapidly in the atmosphere, but other types of issues have also exponentially increased in severity over the last 100 years, especially like tropical forest loss or lots of other issues that you can see here, where we've basically got the same kinds of problems. So what people are now recognizing broadly in sustainability science is that many of our so-called planetary boundaries have been surpassed. We're no longer within the safe operating space of our planet, but especially for issues like climate change, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles and biodiversity loss, we are beyond what is sustainable. We're losing species at a much faster rate than ever before. The climate is moving outside ranges that we have developed our civilizations in over the last 10,000 or so years. And yet at the same time, we're also lacking a vital social foundation still for so many people in the world. There are still many, many people who lack access to basic social issues such as enough food or fresh water, access to an education, with some sort of social equity in the process, including gender equality. So all of these kinds of issues are still very much problematic as well in the world as a whole. And so what we're facing is a sort of two problems at the same time. We are past the biophysical boundaries of the planet, but at the same time, we still haven't managed to lay a decent social foundation for many billions of people in the world. That's then why we need sustainability science. We essentially need to get our act together and come up with ways how we can have enough for everyone now and in the long term. And sustainability science is trying to do essentially exactly that. It basically says sustainability would be a good thing for humankind. So let's see if we can figure out these coupled human environment systems in ways that we can keep them going in the long run. Sustainability science typically recognizes that there are interactions across scales, so space and time. So what I do today influences what we can do tomorrow, but also what happens in the world as a whole influences my local place and the other way around. And much of sustainability science is interdisciplinary, meaning we can't just draw on one scientific discipline to solve all the problems, but we need to draw on many academic disciplines. And we also need to involve non-research actors, stakeholders in society. That could be anyone from local citizens to policymakers to certain experts or farmers, whatever. And we often call that transdisciplinarity. So when we're actually transcending academia in order to work with actors from other backgrounds. Sustainability science isn't as yet defined specifically like many of the old sciences like physics or something, but rather it's often seen as an evolving arena of science. So things are continuously evolving in this area of sustainability science. Now, personally, I like to focus my sustainability science on the landscape scale. And I like to work on the landscape scale because it's a meaningful scale for so many reasons, both ecologically, and Claudia said that's where my background is, but also socially. Often landscapes are inhabited by communities of people, and people can relate to landscapes. And if you can relate to something, you might have an interest in solving the problem there. They're not very abstract. Landscapes are tangible things to people, and they're also a useful scale ecologically. Larger scales are, of course, also important, like the nation scale, but it tends to also aggregate important information. So, for example, I can know about a certain country that it has a high GDP, but that doesn't tell me anything about differences within that country in terms of who's well off and who's not so well off. Or I might find that a certain country has a lot of red listed species, but I don't know whether that's because they have a certain part of the country that has particular species still, or whether maybe the entire country has a lot of biodiversity. So we just don't know when we look at these larger scales what's going on so well. The landscape scale gives us more detailed information. But it's not so detailed, the information, that it overwhelms us entirely. So if we look at individual households or particular forest patches, individual ones, then perhaps it's too idiosyncratic. We can't really say anything general anymore at that point. So that's why I like landscapes very much, because they are sort of a nice intermediate scale that neither suffers from the problems of overgeneralization, nor does it suffer so much from the problem of being extremely idiosyncratic. And when you work at the landscape scale, there's a question of how do you best do this? And with my research team, we try to follow a process that one might call integration by place, case, and process. So first of all, it's important to choose a place that is worth studying. And in the talk today, I want to talk about this place here, Transylvania in central Romania. So first we pick a place. Second, we pick cases or units that we can work on from a range of different perspectives, from an ecological perspective, but also from a social perspective. In our case, we worked on villages. I'll explain that in a little bit on the next slide in a little bit more detail. So that means we pick these cases so we have a common denominator for the social sciences and ecologists, for example. And then finally, we also need flexible processes for integrating things across academic perspectives, but also with stakeholders. For example, I like to work in small teams rather than very large groups of people. I like to have a lot of informal communication, shared office spaces, and also do certain processes with stakeholders to really get to a common and shared understanding of the problems that are going on. And I'll talk a little bit about this last bit of scenario planning, especially later in the presentation today as well. Oops, I skipped one. Here we are. So I don't know how much you know about Transylvania. You possibly know more than I know about Armenia, which is embarrassing, but let's see if there are any parallels, as we might find out in the discussion later on. So I'll give you a tiny bit of background about Transylvania. Transylvania today is inhabited by 4 sort of ethnic groups. Traditionally, it was settled a lot primarily by Saxons. Right now, many of the Saxons have left Romania. Many of them have in fact moved to Germany and other parts of Western Europe. Now the area is primarily dominated by Romanians, but also ethnic Hungarians and Roma, a different ethnic group which is facing a lot of problems in many parts of Europe. After the Second World War, it became part of the sort of communist Eastern Bloc, and then with the collapse of communism, just like for Armenia, things at a slightly different time scale. I think the timing isn't exactly the same, but essentially the same kind of thing happened with the communist bloc collapsing. Land then was restituted to private farmers, and now it's back in the hands of smallholder farmers and the farmland. Things have been very difficult for people since then, and there's been a lot of changes. Romania actually has become part of the European Union, and since 2007, but that has been a very challenging process. And some people are really struggling with this access to the EU, as I will explain a little bit later. So it's very much a system that is in rapid transition, and that I think rapid transition after communism is a story that is probably familiar to many of you as well from the landscapes where you work, and maybe it comes with certain problems, some of which may or may not be similar. The farmland is quite interesting compared especially to many other parts of the European Union. And this is a relatively poor part of the world. Like I said, compared to other parts of the European Union, obviously, when you look at the world as a whole, there are places that are far poorer still. But we find that there are still farmers who plow their fields with horses because they don't have access to tractors. People don't use fertilizer very much, partly because it's expensive. People still mow hay meadows by hand rather than with machines. And we still find cowards and shepherds looking after livestock in the landscape in traditional ways. There are hardly any fences in this landscape. People and livestock roam the landscape with shepherds and cowards. So that is very much still how it has been for many, many decades. And in some ways, some of it is still the same how it was centuries ago. As a result of that, the biodiversity is also very high still compared to many parts of the European Union elsewhere. So, for example, in the forests, we find things like the largest population of the European brown bear. In the farmland, we also find many bird species that are quite rare, like these guys here, or many wildflower species. This here is the yellow-bellied toad, another example of a red-listed species in Western Europe, extremely rare, and that is incredibly common. Basically, when it's wet in the spring, you find these guys in literally every puddle, not a rare species at all. So many of the species that are threatened in Western Europe with extinction are still abundant in Transylvania, and that is, of course, related to these traditional land use practices. So that's the place we found was interesting to look at, because it is rapidly changing and because we have this social change going on, but at the same time, this natural capital, if you like, that is worth kind of looking after in some way. And how does it link? So those were some of the questions we were asked, but I will get to that in a moment. Within the study area, we picked 30 villages as case study areas. And each of these villages, you can think of like a valley, where typically the village is located in the valley, at the valley bottom. Then you have fields and pastures on the hill slopes. And then you have forest, typically on the crests of the hills in the surrounding landscape. And then you have the next valley with the next village. So that's more or less, in very approximate terms, what the landscape looks like. And we worked in 30 such villages, which were then the focal point for both ecological investigations and social science investigations. Our overall goal was to understand the social and ecological changes and the interconnections that were going on in the region in order to help identify avenues for sustainable development. We were interested in things like biodiversity and ecosystem services. We were interested in what do people actually want from the landscape? How is the landscape governed right now? And how is that working? What about equity and justice? Is that working? And we were, of course, interested in integrating all these different kinds of findings, but also integrating our academic work with the understanding of stakeholders. And we used a range of different methods, which I'm happy to take questions on later on if you want. Let's get to some of the key findings. This is a picture of a typical wildflower meadow, and these are known beyond Europe as extremely rich sites where plant species richness at a fine scale is extremely high and in fact rivals some of the most species rich parts in the world at a fine spatial scale. And these kinds of parts of the landscape are well known for the high species richness, but there are many other parts of the landscape that are also potentially interesting and less well studied, like the small arable fields and their field margins, the forests. People have not done as much work on those. We looked at land use in relation to plant diversity, and indeed we confirmed that most of the species are found in grassland. So grassland boasts an incredible number of species if you take a look at and add these numbers up here. So 150 plus 190 plus 50 plus 23. Let's not do the math now, but it's a lot. So I guess that's 200, 400 species or so. So that's a lot of species that occur in grassland, and grassland, in fact, is the most species-rich part of the landscape. That was well known before. But what was interesting to find was that arable land, actually, which is adjacent to this grassland in many cases, arable land, if you include all the little field margins, actually has a huge number of species in it as well, because we have small fields, we have little chemical inputs, and so right next to those small fields, you still have huge numbers of plant species as well in the margins of the fields. So that's a finding that was not so well understood prior to our work there. Perhaps not surprisingly, where you have a lot of different flower species, you have a lot of different organisms that use these flower species, such as butterflies. So this is a picture of the landscape of some of our helpers catching butterfly species. And there was a huge diversity of butterfly species in this landscape as well. 112 species documented. That's amongst the highest, again, anywhere in Europe that you would find. And interestingly, so we documented which kinds of species you find in which parts of the landscape, but we also did some other kinds of things that were a bit more interesting or different perhaps than what other scientists have already done. We looked at the movement patterns of different butterfly species by tracking them through the landscapes. And we found that different species, in fact, move through the landscape in different ways. And those species that are already threatened and that can't move so well will be most severely affected by a further intensification of agricultural landscapes. And intensified landscape means larger fields, more space that needs to be crossed, fewer plant species that can be used in between, and that would be detrimental for those species already listed as threatened species in Europe. For birds, we did similar kinds of surveys, and we found that there were different types of responses. We have forest specialist species that respond positively to woody vegetation cover at small spatial scales, intermediate spatial scales, and large spatial scales. So basically they like trees. Well, forest species like trees, that makes sense. The opposite, open country specialist species, they really don't like trees. So less than average, a negative association with woody vegetation cover here at the small, medium, and large spatial scale. And then we have these farmland birds, which are interesting because they really like woody vegetation at the fine spatial scale, but at the large spatial scale, they don't. So they want landscapes with few trees, but within those landscapes with few trees, they would like trees, please. So the occasional tree in an otherwise open landscape is precisely what makes many of these iconic farmland bird species happy. So that's an interesting finding also. We need a combination, therefore, of landscapes with woody vegetation as well as open areas to cater for all these different kinds of species. And that's precisely what the traditional land use in this landscape has given biodiversity for so long. This species here is an interesting one. It's called the corncrake. It is nocturnal. And if you want to survey it, you have to be out and about in the middle of the night and listen to its calls. Its calls can be heard for hundreds of meters. And then when you drive around the landscape and stop your car and drive a little bit further and stop your car again, you can come up with a nice map of where this species actually occurs. And we found with some statistical models that it is essentially associated right now with exactly what Western Europe has lost: high land cover diversity, remote areas far from villages that are wet, so not drained, and that are quite flat. So those are some of the places that the corncrake likes. It likes this high land cover diversity. So what if we were thinking about a situation where land cover diversity might be lost because of agricultural intensification? We tried to simulate that, and we found that if you have an 11% decrease in land cover diversity, you end up with a 33% decrease in habitat for the corncrake. And if you lose 35% of land cover diversity, you lose 2/3 of the habitat for the corncrake. So again, it's a species that is very much associated with these traditional land use patterns, fine scale mosaic of highly heterogeneous land uses at relatively low levels of agricultural intensity, exactly the sorts of things that are currently being lost. Looking at the forest, maybe the most fascinating story is that people coexist with bears. Throughout the landscape, we find bears occurring essentially. So this is a map here of the bear activity based on many kilometers of transect walks looking for signs of bear activity in the landscape. Bears seem to be everywhere because they benefit from large and connected forest patches that are currently there. And fascinating, I think it's fascinating that people seem to coexist relatively well with bears because they use traditional shepherding techniques. So they use large dogs to protect the flock of sheep from bears, and mostly this is working relatively well. And the shepherds also have relatively high tolerance towards occasional conflicts. So there is a long history of living with bears that is relatively successful and is a nice example of people successfully living with carnivores, which is not the case everywhere in the world at all. Trophic interactions were very much shaped by species like the brown bear and the wolf, which had an influence on things like deer populations. But the human is, of course, a sort of mega carnivore, if you like, a top-level trophic animal in the food chain here. And when we looked at pictures from camera traps that we had placed throughout the landscape, we found that the human, in fact, had the strongest top-down influence of all species. People often talk about top-down influence with carnivores, but in this case, the human has an overwhelming effect of structuring the ecosystem as a whole. So again, human-environment relationships are central here and have evolved in a way where the human plays a significant role, but has not destroyed the system. So what we've learned so far now is that biodiversity in this area is very rich. And we've learned that it's associated with traditional land uses. But what I want to talk about over the next few slides now is, how do people benefit from nature? What do people maybe want from the landscape? How is landscape change being governed? And how might this play out in different parts of the study area? So when we look at the landscape from an ecosystem services perspective, and many of you, if not all of you by now, have been indoctrinated through Claudia what exactly an ecosystem services perspective is. So the benefits of nature are many different ones. They are quite diverse. You could benefit from the forest, you could benefit from orchards, you can benefit from pastures, from arable land. You can benefit indirectly because the landscape is storing carbon, because it's beautiful, that might attract tourists in this part of the world. You can maybe use the landscape for hunting, for biodiversity conservation, or you might like it because it's a source of pollinators for your vegetables. So we looked at all of these possible ecosystem services for each of the 30 villages that we studied, and then the villages were classified, and they fall into 3 groups. We have one group here, and one group here. These down here are the pasture-dominated villages. They have a lot of this orange ecosystem service. These ones are the arable land-dominated villages. They have mostly arable land and not so much of everything else. And the villages with a lot of forest cover around them have a really diverse bundle of ecosystem services. So the most diversity in ecosystem services is in the forest-associated villages, but the others also provide benefits, just a different suite of benefits that is more associated with pastures and with arable land, depending on where you are. We also spoke to people about which ecosystem services they most value through interviews. And it's really interesting, the outcome here, because it's extremely different from what you would get in Western Europe. In Western Europe, people would probably tell you that they like to take their dogs for a walk in the forest or something like that, or they like to go to parks to hear the birds sing, or maybe you would get things like that. Those are often called cultural ecosystem services. What we're finding here is that the most important and most highly valued ecosystem services that people ranked were healthy soils. So we're talking about a population of smallholder farmers. They understand the importance of soils. Clean water, that's a really interesting one. People drink the water directly from the environment still, not from bottles mostly, but directly from wells in the environment. So obviously having a chemical-free environment is very valuable because you can then drink the water there. And the winters are very cold, so people rely on firewood from the forest, and those were the 3 most highly valued ecosystem services in this particular part of the world. Ecosystem services are great because they give people benefits, but the thing is, not everyone benefits in the same way. And what we found is that indeed there are some factors that mediate who gets to benefit from ecosystem services. Some services, so it depends on the service itself. So firewood, maybe the access to it is different from, for example, pastures. So it depends on the service to start with. Then it depends on the rules about that service. And then it depends a lot on social and power relations and who's linked to who. Depends on household decisions and individual contexts, on equity perceptions, and on individually held values of what you really want from nature. All of these things taken into account, what we found was that the large farmers, the officials, and people already wealthy were those who were able to extract most of the ecosystem services, whereas smallholder farmers and poor people were not able to benefit from the environment in the same way. So there's a clear equity component to sustainable development here, or rather to not sustainable development, in that not everyone is able to benefit from the environment in the same way. For example, some shepherds with not so many livestock were unable to access community pastures because they were rented out primarily to large farmers, which was simply more profitable for the officials. So there's a lot of patterns like that going on. We also talk to people about what they really want from the landscape. And we asked them to sort photographs for that, photographs of what the landscape might look like in the future or what it might contain in the future. Here's an example of some people ranking photographs, and here's an example of one of the outcomes. So for example, we always ask them to arrange things in such a diamond shape. For example, these people here wanted to see modernization in the landscape. They wanted to see a tractor like that, big tractor, big intensive agricultural field, a modern house. And they also liked these traditional costumes and things. But what they really didn't want to see was this is a horse and cart. So this sort of poor type of agriculture is not what these people wanted. They wanted to see basically modernization of agriculture. On the other hand, other people want different things. Here we also see the costumes were quite popular, but up here we see a shepherd. So a shepherd with his flock of sheep. Where's that shepherd over here in the middle somewhere? Not so popular. That's really important. They believe that this sort of traditional land use as symbolized through the shepherd, that's something worth maintaining into the future. Whereas a modern house like that, no, that's horrible, and we don't want this big tractor either. So very different story here compared between here and here. So we then call this group the prosperity and wealth type people, and this year the balance and tradition type people. So different people have contested preferences here. And it's really important then to think about, well, how do you navigate this? You're not going to get these people to agree on the exact same thing tomorrow, but maybe we need to recognize that people want this landscape to go in different directions and start to have conversations about it so that ultimately it can be resolved. We spoke with many villagers about governance challenges as well. And what we learned was that there were low levels of human capital, social capital, infrastructure capital, and financial capital. In other words, education is not so great, access to doctors and so on is not so great. Mistrust is high, post-communism especially, and corruption is a significant problem. Infrastructure is not so great. Some houses are not connected to good roads or even to running water in some cases. Financial capital is a problem. There are not so many ways of really making money in this landscape. So these are significant barriers to development. There simply isn't a lot there. But on the other hand, what is there at the moment, and a lot of it, is natural capital. The environment is in wonderful shape because it hasn't been destroyed. And cultural capital is also still high. There are a lot of very valuable traditions, old buildings, and so on, that are very much treasured by local people as well as by tourists. And that could also be a possible foundation for future development. So what we're arguing in our work is that you need to build on something. You can't build on these capitals because they're not there, but you can build on natural capital and cultural capital, which is what you have as a starting point in the landscape. So it's important to not also degrade those capitals, because then you have nothing. From a governance perspective, also, many people reported a mismatch between the realities in this landscape and the policies that had been imposed by the EU, especially for things like agricultural subsidies. Agricultural subsidies in the EU are primarily driven by area. So if you have large farms, you get a lot of subsidies. If you have small farms, you get only a little bit of subsidies. And if you have extremely small farms, you don't get anything. And many of these people have very small farms and actually get very little or nothing. And so EU policies were not seen as something that was helping them, but rather accession to the EU was sometimes seen as something that made things even harder than it had been before. Interesting perspective, certainly. And also sometimes the modern rules can undermine the traditional rules and value systems. So for example, traditionally people shared their pastures amongst all villagers. Now there are financial incentives involved through new governance regulations, and it's often the large farmers that benefit while the small ones are being left out. Looking into the future, we try to develop scenarios via participatory assessment of the dynamics that were going on. We spoke with 17 different organizations representing social, environmental, and economic concerns about the region. And we asked them about what are the main changes that you have observed? What are the changes in the past? What changes do you observe maybe in the present, and what do you anticipate for the future? And what's driving those changes? Based on that, we tried to develop a causal loop diagram of the social ecological system. And we then simplified that into a single consensus diagram that most people found agreeable. And that diagram looks like this. In the center of it, you find profitability of small-scale farming. It's really an issue for people that small-scale farming is no longer profitable. This means that they either abandon their land and give up agriculture altogether, which means forest regrowth in such areas, or they intensify the use of farmland because that's another way of making more money, or they sell their land to foreigners who then intensify the land. Either way, farmland biodiversity ends up losing as because the small-scale farming is what led to high farmland biodiversity. If you lose it, you lose farmland biodiversity. Low profitability is related to a weak economy, and a weak economy is related to a sort of poverty cycle where as you have a lot of poverty, you have more conflicts. Many conflicts means you have low social capital. Low social capital tends to mean you don't have very good education. And if you have no good education, you probably end up with more poverty. And that is a reinforcing feedback loop here, where you sort of have what one might call a poverty trap. So how to break out of this thing? That's one of the key questions. And there are some of the kinds of factors that influence this from the outside that could help. So for example, maintaining traditions seems to enhance social capital, and it is a good thing and somehow works against this spiral. And there are various of these kinds of patterns. So overall, this is the dynamics we established for the region. And without looking at this in like too much detail now, we took this as the basic starting point for what would the future look like. Talking to people about what changes are happening that are in your control and that are beyond your control, and which of these changes are perhaps potentially highly uncertain. And highly uncertain changes are interesting because they enable us to think about the future and go like, what if? So what if a certain thing happens that I just don't know what's going to happen? And I can think about that, and then I can prepare for the future in a different way from if I hadn't thought about that uncertainty. One such uncertainty identified by local people was whether the emphasis in national policy and EU policy in the future was going to be pro-economy in the future or rather pro-environment. It could go either way. There were some trends towards greening the common agricultural policy, for example. That might mean it's moving more towards a pro-environment sort of setting, or it stays as a sort of pro-economy type setting. We just don't know. On the other hand, you might also have another type of uncertainty, which is, do local people work together and capitalize on the community, on the opportunities that are around, or do they fight, and is there corruption and they're not able to capitalize on the opportunities that present themselves? Those were identified as two key uncertainties. So what will happen to policy, and how will local people deal with changes in the future? If you combine these two axes, you end up with a sort of coordinate system like that with quadrants, and each quadrant describes a possible, plausible future. So up here is a future, for example, where the future policy environment is pro-environment, and local people are able to work together and capitalize on opportunities. And this quadrant here, for example, would be where the emphasis is on the economy, but people are able to capitalize on opportunities and work together, and so on. So if we put all this together, we end up with 4 alternative futures or future scenarios. We gave them names that you can see here, and each of them is associated with particular types of features. So for example, if we have a situation that favors economic policy and where people work together, then maybe we end up with a sort of Western European style development. We end up with agricultural intensification, we end up with economic and social improvements, but we end up with a deterioration of the natural environment. On the other hand, if we get to this scenario here, pro-economic emphasis, but now local people are caught up in fighting and corruption, then we probably end up with land being invested in by foreigners. We end up with intensification, exploitation of local communities and intensification of land use. Local people leave or are poor, and there's going to be low social capital and many conflicts. This is happening in parts of Romania now. It is actually happening. It's not some sort of fiction that we made up. It is happening. It's just not happening in that study area yet. So these scenarios based on this were turned into text and also into artwork to communicate with local people. We disseminated it in local languages as in various different formats, including a fictional personalized account of each future. So someone living in the future, a fictive character, talks about it and says like, well, what is life in my village like right now, you ask? Well, it's like this, and then talking about that future. So we try to sort of use narrative in a way to communicate this to people that would make sense to local people so they could connect to it. This is the artwork, stylized painting of what the landscape looks like right now. We see small fields here, we see a village, we see a little bit of logging in the forest, but not so much. We do see a tractor, but we still see someone with horses here as well. We have a shepherd, we have these species-rich wildflowers in the foreground. So this is very much what a traditional landscape looks like right now. This is what it might look like if there's this scenario of land grabbing. So if the economic incentives are high and there's local corruption, probably someone's going to sell land and make a lot of money out of it. And factory farming is essentially what the foreigners might well like to do in this part of the world, like they are doing in parts of southern Romania already. Alternatively, if there's pro-environment type development and local people work hard to build up good social relations and infrastructure, then perhaps it's going to become a primary tourist destination for people, which we already see in parts of the study area now as well. There are really efforts underway for making it something that's really popular for bike tourists from Europe, for alternative cultural, agricultural tourism. So vineyards have been reinstated here. So specialty foods and specialty wines, that's the sort of thing that is also happening in parts of the landscape already. Missed opportunity denotes a scenario where the emphasis was on sort of sustainable environmental development, but people were too caught up in their fights and corruption and so on, so that someone comes from Western Europe and builds an organic farm. This is with these sort of little plastic sheets covering the crops as little micro greenhouses there. So basically factory farming in an organic style happening, a missed opportunity for local communities. And finally, this is the one that is a little bit like Western European style development. People are better off, but the environment is very much simplified. So all of these scenarios are deemed plausible, but we also reason that not every scenario is equally plausible in all locations. Some places are flat and close to roads, and those places are going to be prime candidates for intensification in the future. And whether you see that as an opportunity, as a risk, that's where it's most likely to happen. Tourism, on the other hand, will be really good in the places that are quite forested and hilly and have these big old churches that are very popular with tourists. So tourism opportunities sit somewhere a bit different in the landscape, and so on and so forth. So we have different kinds of inertia in different parts of the landscape, which means that the scenarios, that's the 4 scenarios here, will, of course, they all apply to everywhere, but they'll play out likely at different intensities, depending on which way the region as a whole goes. They'll play out to different extents and different intensities across the landscape. There are certain places at particular risk of intensification or abandonment, or particularly suitable for tourism, and so on and so forth. All of these findings we try to communicate also to local people. here's an example of a sort of stakeholder event where we try to communicate. We set up these little tents in different villages and travel through the villages and basically talk to local people about what we had found is taking place as changes in the area. Lots of different posters we designed and little booklets in local languages and so on to communicate these changes to local people. And local people were really very much engaged and excited, and especially the scenarios were something that many people could connect with, because there is no question more relevant to anyone really than what does my future look like? It's a really interesting and relevant question to many people. So we basically did this little tour. We also had a traveling poster exhibition through the landscape, open access books, postcards, thousands of them handed out, showing the scenarios. Here's a little voting exercise where school children were asked to vote for what sort of scenario they most like. You see that democracy is new to Romania here because people throw in multiple matches into one box when they were allowed only one vote. But the point here was basically just to engage people and get them to think about what might the future look like and what can I do? What does this have to do with me? What can I do to get to the future that maybe I want for my landscape? I'm getting to the end now. So as some working hypotheses for traditional rural landscapes, I would say that natural capital provides a solid foundation for development, especially when other capital stocks might be lacking. Market-oriented incentives are useful to get the economy going, but they can also erode a traditional stewardship ethic, which is sometimes very strong in such landscapes. Good governance is critical and is a major problem in some settings, certainly in Romania. Equity issues need to be dealt with as social structures change and as the opportunities to make money change in different ways. And in the absence of a benevolent dictator, some sort of perfect government that wants sustainable development, change really needs to happen through empowering communities from the bottom up. This is the context against which all of this is playing out, as I mentioned before. And I would argue that one of the challenges we're facing is that we have overshot some sort of sustainability target for many of these indicators. And the question now is, how do we get back to a sustainability target? It's nice to take these pragmatic actions right now, but we need to make sure that we actually bend this curve all the way. To bend the curve all the way, I just want to close with this final comment that we need to combine pragmatic measures in the right now with really looking long and hard at the foundational issues that underpin all of this. So what are the values we hold about landscapes? What does it mean to live a good life? These are questions that we really need to ask alongside the pragmatic measures of policy change that maybe many of us are maybe interested in. So that's my last slide. Landscape sustainability science, I've argued, can bring together social and ecological understandings at a meaningful scale. And my last comment now was that we need to alternate between practical versus foundational. So practical is necessary, but if we only focus on the practical, that can amount to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, meaning we're making the chairs a little bit nicer, but the Titanic's still sinking. So if we don't want our ship to sink, we need to also address the foundational problems of unsustainability. That's our values, our paradigms, and our social economic systems in a broader and more fundamental sense. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, thanks to the many people who were part of this research. This certainly wasn't just my research, but the research of a whole team. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Jan, for a fascinating talk, sharing so many experiences, insights, examples from Romania with us. I'm sure that many of the people in the audience can relate to this. Before entering a discussion, I would now ask if you have immediate questions. So is there anything where you would need more information? Any things which remained unclear? So this is a question to all of the people here attending. So please, is there anything where you would need more information from the side of Jan?
Can I just jump in with one question, Claudia? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Now I understand why sustainability is a science, because it's massive amounts of work that have gone into this. That is actually my question. How sustainable is this approach to landscape planning? Or how do you use an approach like this to make it reasonably possible to do in many settings? Because it's very research intensive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I see this not so much as a once-off approach for solving a problem, but more as put it this way: there are a lot of scientists running around the face of the planet right now, and I think we all can do something towards, let's say, sustainability, to use a broad term like that. And this is the kind of science that I think we can do. And it's the sort of science that gets conversations started. I don't think of it so much as solving a problem. In fact, in a way, we haven't solved any problem, but we can't solve any problem because there isn't a one actor who will then sort of do the thing and sort of solve the problem. That's simply not how it works, but rather it's a very messy situation, many actors involved, all actors need to somehow engage and kind of together develop ways how the future is shaped. So I think this is a way in which scientists can engage with this. And of course, it's true for landscapes elsewhere in the world too. There are scientists, and this is something that I think scientists can do to be part of that conversation. It is definitely not something we can do like this everywhere in terms of because of the amount of people and work required. So I completely agree with you, but I think we can also take some of the approach or the ethos of it and do it in a smaller way, in a more modest way. So you can do this with master students, you can do this with NGO actors. So you can do this in a scaled down way, not publishing 20 journal articles, but rather still using some of these kinds of ways of engaging with people. And the scenario work, for example, it can be done at a high end and you write publications and so on, but it can also be done in simpler workshops with community, and that can still be very useful. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Tamara, I see you raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, John, very much for the presentation. I joined late, but I'm working for an organization that is the Secretariat of the Acopian Convention, with multilateral environmental mechanism that serves somehow to support sustainable development of the Carpathian Mountains, of which, of course, Romania has quite. I have seen that some of your villages were not so far from the Carpathian Mountain region. And curiosity, I wonder, have you, during your research and work with the local organizations, ever heard of this convention? Did it come up in any way or not at all? Thank you.
I didn't hear, you were breaking up a tiny bit. Can you please say the name of the convention again?
Carpathian Convention.
So no, I haven't. We are not in the Carpathians exactly, though. We're in the foothills, and I do think that there is still a distinctly distinct difference still. So it's possible difference in the sense that the Carpathians proper are much more forested and much more kind of mountain meadow type situation. So not having heard of it may not mean anything, because we are really more on the foothills. So once you get into the mountains proper, it's still a different thing, even culturally, I would say. So I haven't heard of it, but it could be that it's because we were more on the foothills.
I see a next hand up, and that's Arthur Grigorian. Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a very short question. And the question is, are there effective tools for monetary conversion of ecosystems, preferably practically practical tools?
I was having a few issues hearing you well. I think it's the connection. I understood not so well what you were saying. Maybe what we could do is you type the question into the chat, and we take one more before, and then I come back to it if you could type it in that meantime.
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion. I think it was about monetary evaluation of ecosystem services. But let's make sure if this is really what it was about. So please write it in the chat, and we will first address another question we have in the chat. So you said that people were very excited to participate in the local workshops. And the question is, was this the case from the very beginning of the project, or did you have to work for it to achieve this level of participation? And what were the barriers and enablers for participation of rural communities?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's also relative, right? I mean, those who weren't excited, they just didn't show up, I suppose. So of course we see a bias set when we do this. But typically, like I said, there is no question that is more engaging for people than the future of their place. It is the most engaging question you can come with. And if you don't come with telling people often people come and tell people what to do. You should do this, you should do that, development should do this, development should do that. If you do the opposite and say like, I wonder what the future will be like. Do you want to talk about it? And what do you think, and what do you want it to be like? And would that be good? Would that be bad? And you actually ask questions and listen to people. Then after a while, I think you get a bit of, let's say, respect from local communities for that sort of different approach rather than being told what to do. We were also lucky to work with some local partners, and we had Romanian project members and so on, so that language wasn't a challenge. And so I think we had a good start in the sense of having a culturally appropriate way of dealing with people because of having team members who understand that sort of stuff well from being from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I still don't see Arthur's question on the chat. Therefore, I would hand over first to Tigran Kerrigan. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you very much, Jon, for this interesting presentation. I'll be curious to know what was the level of participation of locals in your research, and how did you motivate them to take part in your research?
Yeah, so I think we need to maybe distinguish between different types of activities. So some of them were, some of these activities were simply data collection. So things like interviews with people, or so where we just collect data. And then later on, we also had workshops where you work with people to do something together. And then we had these outreach events where we communicate results back to people. Getting people engaged in interviews was relatively simple. Basically, people, if you approach them in the right way, they're willing to talk and tell you about stuff and problems. And so that was easy. For the workshops, we mainly worked through particular stakeholder organizations. So if you want a workshop, let's say with 25 people, well, you can't invite hundreds and hundreds of community members themselves, but you can make sure that you invite different kinds of maybe NGOs or economic partners or a women's group, or you find representatives of different kinds of groups. So that's how we worked for the workshops more. And for the outreach events, we simply went there. We went to places and set up our tents and then just saw who comes by. And yeah, lots of people came by. So because it's very unusual, no one comes to these villages and sets up tents and communicates anything to them. So doing that simply made it interesting enough for many people to see what's going on. So I think a bit like that.
Thank you very much.
So now we have the question, and it's indeed on tools or mechanisms for the monetary conversion of ecosystem services, preferably practically used tools. So used for the assessment of ecosystem losses for an industrial project, mining, for instance. Yeah. So what can you say on this, Jon?
It's not actually something we did. So we didn't go that way. We talked to people about so we spoke of ecosystem services more through well, like I showed you before, the picture of how much of which do you have in which kind of village, the sort of flower diagram with the different sides to it. And then we did an assessment through the scenarios of how the different services would change with which scenario. But we didn't do that in a quantitative way, and we didn't try to do monetary evaluation. Somehow, there are good sides and bad sides to doing monetary evaluation. So the good side is, of course, you end up with very clear numbers that are potentially very powerful in terms of convincing decision makers. The bad side is that there's a lot of uncertainty to how exactly these are calculated, and people disagree a lot on how they ought to be calculated. And so therefore you can also get into a lot of trouble and a lot of disagreement about the monetary value. So what we try to do is instead highlight the general trade-offs. So if you want to go for the scenario that is like this Western European style development, you will lose natural capital. We didn't quantify how much natural capital you would lose exactly. And one could now argue maybe we should have, but we preferred somehow to keep the conversation at this more general level and look at these trade-offs in general terms. In general terms, everyone can connect with them, and every villager can see in a painting, this is what's going to happen. I like that, or I don't like that. If you turn it into numbers, it becomes persuasive in an economic sense, but you're also losing many people from the conversation, and perhaps you're making yourself vulnerable to criticism about how exactly the numbers were generated. So I think, anyway, we didn't do it. Certainly some people do it. I don't know if you talked about the Invest platform. I don't know exactly what your work is, but if you do work in geographic information systems yourself, then the Invest platform is a modeling platform that people often use for monetary evaluation of ecosystem services.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Lisa Hönsch.
Hello, I'm not so sure you can answer this question because it goes pretty far already into the action and maybe implementation rather than the research, but do you have any insights or ideas on the possible discrepancy between people's understanding of the urgency of the topic and the importance of biodiversity and their actual maybe willingness or even ability to act on it? Because this is where I see most of the problems. It's always nice to have these measures and awareness raising, but then to really make people, first of all, convince them in kind of one session of whatever workshop or something, and then also have them able to do something, you know, within their own ability.
Yeah, exactly. So the convincing them, I think, is the least of the problems in that study area. Meaning people understand what's happening, they can see it, and you can see it, like I said, in other parts of Romania, you can see it. You can see there are foreign investors coming, taking away large amounts of land from local people. The local people are not better off after that, and the environment is not better off either. So these kinds of changes are visible and people know about them. And so convincing them of the story behind it is not really so much of a problem. What is much harder is to see who has the agency to do anything here. And smallholder farmers in particular have very little agency. So what we've tried to do is, because there is this top-down policy making through the EU agricultural policy especially is incredibly powerful. So what we've tried to do for that reason is primarily work also with NGO type actors and so on, who are relatively speaking more powerful than the individual smallholder farmer. And I feel like one needs to be a bit realistic about what projects like this can do. No single project typically turns around the fate of a region, but we all, I think, can contribute in some way. And I see it as a contribution towards basically strengthening the narrative around sustainable development, which helps the NGOs who are working on these things already anyway in a more concerted effort, put their energy together, not argue with each other. They met at workshops and they realized, oh, we're doing the same thing. I know, for example, that one of the NGOs took our scenario slides, when they went to the EU and gave a presentation about future of the landscape, and they took these slides and presented it there. So it's not very direct, unfortunately, the benefits, but somehow it's part of a very messy process, because this idea that we must inform the decision maker, even with monetary numbers, who will then make a better decision, I think that idea is false. Like, governance doesn't work like that, but it's many actors who are creating some big mess. And it's those many actors we need to somehow engage and then navigate and hope that we get through at the other end. So I don't know if that helps at all.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
This also taps a little bit into the other question we are having here on the chat. Mariam Hakobian is thanking you for your presentation, and she asks, what main points or features do we need to take into account to make such kind of research happen? So what kind of starting points would you suggest? Where do you start? Do you start with climate-related research, biodiversity-related research, biodiversity, or people's needs? What is your advice here?
So I think it's a nice idea to start somewhere where it makes sense to people. So we started with this general notion of landscape change, because landscape change is something that people are seeing around them and were worried about. So if in your particular landscape, just as an example, maybe water scarcity is an issue, then maybe it is climate change that you start with. Maybe it's water scarcity that you start with. So I think starting with things that people can relate to is very good. And then when you do that, you quickly realize that the one thing that they're concerned about, so in our case, for example, was profitability of small scale farming, right? But you find that that's not an issue on its own, but it's related to many other issues. And so I think I would recommend to take focal issues like that, to draw people into conversations that ultimately are not just about that one technical issue, but that open questions about what's happening to our landscape as a whole on the environmental side and on the social side, and how is all this connected. So I would use something tangible to open the conversation and then expand into a broader system.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jörn. Now many questions have been raised. I would now like to move on to our panelists and ask them to share their perspectives on your talk. Also maybe making a bit more connection to the Armenian context. We have 4 great panelists here aboard, and I will now one by one ask each of them to share their perspectives, their views on your talk. And I would like to start with Dr. Tigran Kerrigan, who is here with us today. Tigran, let me introduce him a little bit to you, is a doctor of social and economic sciences, which he completed not in Armenia, but he completed it in Vienna in Austria as part of a Transitions to Sustainability graduate program. His research focuses a lot on transdisciplinary approaches, and he is typically carrying out these projects in a post-Soviet context. So Armenia and Caucasus and Georgia more precisely. He is currently based in Portugal, so another transition in terms of the geographical space where he is working. And Tigran, our question to you would be, you have been involved in so many research projects, particularly in this post-Soviet context. What are your reflections on Jörn's talk? Maybe the working hypothesis that Jörn raised at the end of his talk.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I will also tell that I was involved in a project called Caucasus Tea, which finished this year, and the aim was implementing transdisciplinarity approaches for sustainable tourism development in 4 case study regions in Armenia and Georgia. And we also, during 4 years, we had also different case studies with local population, with decision makers and different actors of society, as well as with academics. And based on Jörn's presentation, regarding biodiversity, I guess our other panelists can present better. But what I want to mention that this was a nice example of university community collaboration. Unfortunately, in Armenia and Georgia, universities, especially state universities, are not so involved with real life problems, with local societal problems, which such kind of projects mostly implemented by NGOs, which are short term. And based on my research and interviews, I can say that sometimes when there's a short project and implemented by NGO and making interaction with local population, also giving promises, and then not showing up, people start have lack of trust towards researchers and academics. And I think that universities in our region should be more connected to local societies and also make their research questions and research topics based on real life issues. It can be co-designed and also co-implemented, because when the solutions are designed and made together, it will be more practically easy to implement. And another thing, this is also research capacity of universities, because as we know, during post-Soviet Union time, the research capacity of universities was mostly assigned to academia of sciences as pure academic institutions. So university mostly focused on teaching, and high load of teaching hours also is an obstacle for university researchers to be involved in real research with local communities. To concluding what I'm saying, I think that we need to have more long-term cooperation with universities and communities to have more data and to achieve long-term results for sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Jan, do you have any immediate reaction to what Tigran was talking about? Maybe again, going back to the example in Romania. So how did you work there with local universities?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely nice comments, and indeed the role of universities or of research is really tricky. Certainly in the Romanian context, it was really tricky because you have expertise around to an extent, but then yes, you have people flooded also in teaching, but you also, frankly, you have a mindset that sometimes isn't so helpful. You have a mindset of the expert, we know, the local community has no idea, we know what's best, we are the scientists. So you also come across this quite a lot. So you need the time, like Tigran said, but you also need the sort of attitude somehow in order to be able to really work with local people, and the humility to listen and maybe learn something that maybe you've thought about things in the wrong way or in only one way, and there are other ways in which you might think about the problem. So that is, I would add that that the people's minds also need to be, it takes a certain attitude to working with people and doing this sort of transdisciplinary work. It's not just time, and I'm sure Tigran would agree with that. I think the other thing that struck me from what he was saying was this issue of promises. And NGOs often have to make promises because they're somehow in the business of actually solving problems. And like I've said before, when you asked, like, well, I don't know that we've really solved problems, but we've tried to contribute in the way that we can as researchers towards problem solution. I sometimes worry about the rhetoric in transdisciplinary science where we always need to solve problems. And sometimes we can't solve problems. In this case, there is, like I said, the simple problem is there is no actor in charge, but rather it's a mess of a multitude of actors who are in charge. And hence there is no problem to be solved, but there is a messy situation to be navigated. And we can all contribute towards navigating this messy situation better. So that's where I sometimes feel like the situations where we have clean problems that can be solved are relatively few in sustainability. Mostly they're messy problems and there are many people involved. And so that gets tricky. But not having promised anything, like we didn't promise anything, what we basically promised was that we would talk with people and think about what kinds of things who can do make things better. But that doesn't mean there is at the end the perfect solution. But that's sort of I think a useful way through it. So you promise less, but that way you might achieve more somehow.
Just a small remark in order to be clear. By promising, I was meaning just the financial promises. And for us as researchers, it is always hard to convince people to cooperate and to explain that there can be benefits beyond financial benefits, in order to co-creating solutions, etc.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. So navigating.
So maybe, sorry, can I just pick up on that? That reminds me of what I said about this issue of social capital, in a sense, like people, especially in there's literature on this, in post-communist places, people have sometimes, they disengage altogether. So anyone who wants to talk to them about solving anything or anything for the common cause or whatever, it's like people are, nah, leave me alone. What's in it for me? And it's because they're so used to isolating and no longer participating. So I think that is sometimes this legacy effect, and overcoming that can be really hard. So I think what you mean by that. So getting people involved is actually a hard thing when they're so used to disengaging because of the history that they've had.
And so this topic of capacity building, of navigating messy problems, trying really to include and engage people at the local level, this brings me to one of our other panelists. And now here I jump a little bit to our panelist number 4, Nune Sarukanian, who is here with us today. She holds a PhD in agricultural sciences and is very active in many regards. So primarily she is a sustainable agriculture consultant, committed to finding practical scientific solutions to problems connected to the field of agriculture and environment. So precisely this interface here again. And she puts a particular emphasis on transfer of knowledge and skills to students, farmers, scientists, or just anyone interested in the field. She is very well connected within the country, also well connected, for instance, with the Armenian National Agrarian University, and she has received numerous awards and recognitions for her activities. So I learned that she won a Women's Creative Thinking in Rural Life Award. And she was also recognized as a female hero, being awarded a gold medal from the government of the Republic of Armenia as a recognition for being an ambassador in the field of agriculture. So Nune, please, what are your points on this topic? Are you here with us? Hello, and you are very welcome to speak in Armenian if you wish.
Հենց հայերեն կխոսեմ, ուղղակի չգիտեմ ինչի էկրանը միգուցե այս պրեզենտացիաներն են դեռ վրան չեմ հասկանում, ինչպես կարող ենք բոլորին տեսնել, լավ, ինչևէ, արդեն ներկայացրեց շատ լավ, արդեն Կլաուդիան ներկայացրեց, շատ շնորհակալ եմ, հատկապես շնորհակալ եմ պարոն Ժորեն Ֆիշերի, երևի ճիշտ եմ ասում անուն ազգանունը չգիտեմ, շատ հետաքրքիր եւ բովանդակալից աշխատանքի համար։ Ես նշեմ, որ շատ հարազատ թեմա է, շատ հոգեհարազատ, քանի որ ինքս արդեն երևի ավելի քան 7 անգամ լինելով Տրանսիլվանիայում եւ բազմաթիվ խմբերի հետ այցելելով ֆերմերներ, ուսանողներ, գիտնականներ, շատ կարեւոր է հենց Ռումինիայի փորձը մեզ համար, շատ կարևոր է հենց Ռումինիայի փորձը մեզ համար, որպես նախկին սոցլագերի երկիր, այսինքն մենք բավականին շատ նմանություններ ունենք եւ կարծես թե անցել ենք այն դժվար ճանապարհը, որը յուրահատուկ է հենց այդ երկրներին։ Տեսեք, լինելով շատ երկրներում ավելի զարգացած, շատ տեսնում հիանում ենք, բայց երբեմն նրանց փորձը մեզ համար պարզապես կրկնօրինակելի չէ, եւ բացի այդ Տրանսիլվանիայի հետ կապված մի երկու կարևոր հանգամանք, որ հայերը դեռևս 400 տարի առաջ շատ մեծ հազարավոր հայեր բնակություն են հաստատել հենց Տրանսիլվանիայում, եւ եթե նույնիսկ այցելում ենք որոշ գյուղեր, այնտեղ մի փոքր ականատես ենք լինում հայկական մշակույթին, հայկական սկսած կներեք գերեզմանոցներից մինչև եկեղեցիներ եւ այլ տարածքներ, որը անչափ կարևոր է եւ շատ կարևորում եմ այս զեկուցումը հատկապես հենց այն ոլորտում, որտեղ որ մենք քննարկում ենք։ Այստեղ պարզապես Ռումինիայում մի շատ կարևոր փաստ նկատեցի, որ հայերս շատ կարևոր է որ կրկնօրինակենք եւ որ նրանք կենսաբազմազանությունը, իրենց ավանդույթը, իրենց մշակույթը հենց դարձնում են եկամտի աղբյուր, որը մեր մոտ ցավոք դեռևս այնքան էլ զարգացած չէ, չգիտես ինչու ավելի շատ ձգտում ենք, ավելի շատ են քննադատամոտենում այն ամենին, ինչը մենք ունենք, բայց պարզապես կարելի է այլ աչքով նայել եւ սկսած կենսաբազմազանությունից, սկսած բնապահպանությունից դարձնել իրոք եկամտի աղբյուր, որի փորձը այսօր մենք ունենք։ Տիգրանի հետ խոսելու հետ կապած մի փոքր ես համաձայն եմ ՀԿ-ների հետ կապած, բայց Տիգրան ջան, ասեմ, որ եթե ցանկացած իրեն հարգող ՀԿ ինձ թվում է անպայման համագործակցում է գիտնականների հետ, դա կլինի ամերիկյան համալսարան, օրինակ մենք պարոն Ալենա Միխանյանի հետ, մեր Կովկասի բնապահպանական կազմակերպությունների ցանցի հետ շատ հաճելի համագործակցություն ենք ունեցել, որտեղ հստակ տարանջատել ենք ՀԿ սեկտի անելիքները, գիտական ոլորտի եւ այլը, եւ այստեղ նաեւ մի փոքր նկատառում, օրինակ, երբ որ մենք խոսում ենք, որ ֆինանսական կամ ինչ կամ այդ մարդկանց ակնկալիքների մասին կամ խոստումների, ինձ թվում է այստեղ շատ մեծ կարևորություն ունի նորմալ հարաբերությունների ձևավորումը, այսինքն առաջին մեր ամենամեծ խնդիրը, թե ֆերմեր, թե ուսանող, թե գիտնական, թե ճիշտ հարաբերությունների ձևավորումն է, որ նրանք հասկանան, որ մենք իրոք նրանց հետ ենք, այնտեղ ենք, որպեսզի օգնենք իրենց, որպեսզի համատեղ բարձրացնենք այն խնդիրները, որոնք այսօր կան մեր մոտ, եւ համատեղ գտնենք լուծումներ ներգրավվելով նաև հենց իրենց, հենց առաջին օգտագործողին, այսինքն այդ բնական ռեսուրսների առաջին օգտվողին, այդ գյուղաբնակներին։ Ես ինչ կարող եմ ասել, ես պարզապես այնքան լավ էր ներկայացված ամենը բնական լանդշաֆտների, դրանց, ասենք, տարբեր մոտեցումների հետ, որ պարզապես ես Հայաստանում մի փոքր բան կցանկանամ ավելացնել կամ տեղեկացնել, ես գիտեմ, որ ամերիկյան համալսարանը շատ մեծ աշխատանքներ է կատարում այն ուղղությամբ, բայց այնուամենայնիվ կարելի է ահազանգել, որ վերջին ավելի քան 25 տարում մենք հենց վայրի ուտելի բույսերի առումով ունեցել ենք բավականին մեծ կորուստ, այսինքն համաշխարհային նշանակություն ունեցող մեր էկոհամակարգը, մեր կենսաբազմազանությունը այսօր վտանգված է, 87 տեսակ, պատկերացրեք, վայրերի ուտելի բույսեր, որոնք այսօր արդեն գտնվում են կարմիր գրքում, վերջին 25 տարում.
In Red Book for the past 25 years, it is unfortunate because most of all these plants are used by the inhabitants of villages, and in the northern parts, in Sunik region, more than 15% of their daily food is those plants. So for a long time we worked on this problem, and we concluded that it is important to include these plants in, so we should work on it, and we should try to make profit from them. And she lists the names of the plants, so we can find those plants which are in danger of being extincted and make some profit from it. The sector of NGOs pays huge attention to that tension and the use of those resources by the inhabitants of the villages. They go to those lands and pick them, all of them, without thinking whether those plants are in danger or not. They do not wait for just 1 month that these plants grow bigger, but and later take their animals to eat, but they go to the lands and pick them. And our experience showed that if you go to that community, if you talk to the people, go show what should be done, and they see by their own eyes how important those plants are, and if they grow them in their own in their own houses, it would be more profitable. They will listen to you. During our last initiative, we encourage those people who grow those plants near their houses, and we said that we are ready to buy seeds from them and give it to farmers. So here, NGOs, scientists, farmers, they cannot be left out. Any of these actors cannot be left out. So it is important to work with all of them in order to keep that biodiversity. So we should not only go and say that it is important, but we should go and take their hand and show why it is important. As a person who works for a long time in this field, I know the truth that in this cycle, when you work with land, if you leave the farmer in one part of this cycle, for example, you leave them for doing only one thing, they will not go further. It is important to include them in all the parts of the cycle, so up to the supermarkets. Recently, in the Davos Chirac regions, now I'm talking when I talk about the how to save wild plants, they start to think what they can do. We go and together with them and make certificates for them, and they find out that they need to pay little money for getting that certificate. And for in a few days, they can earn much more money, and we make the process easier, and they get surprised. When we show how to pack those plants, for example, they see it is not that difficult. You know, we also have learning centers in Zorakpur, in Davos, Chirac regions. There we also teach and show that cycle from the land to the supermarket. For example, we say that there are 11 species of that plant, and one of them is in danger. We say, we put it in some bus and sell it on the market. If there are very little number of such plants in Armenia, if you do it, in a few years, we will lose these plants. Maybe I take too much time. There are other participants who should speak, but I hope that later we'll have the opportunity to discuss this, including representatives from NGOs, from schools and other sectors. Maybe we can discuss it and find out how can we make the issue more easier, and so that the farmers see that the problem is not so huge and we can solve it together. If there are any further questions connected to keeping biodiversity connected to our region. Maybe we could meet in smaller groups and have additional discussions. That's it. If you have any questions, I would also say that we do more researches in parallel with pilot programs. Sometimes they are only surveys, researches. We maybe on the topic of biodiversity, we did some 20, 30 researches in Armenia, but I think it would be better to do some more practical steps. Unfortunately, the solutions are late. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Nune, for your contribution and for also highlighting this topic of wild plants, wild plant harvest, which perhaps is exactly one of these starting points for this kind of approach that Jörn was advocating for, because it is very relevant to local people, to the communities, and it's precisely at the interface between biodiversity conservation, and rural livelihoods, stopping rural exodus also. So it might be one of these areas where activities could really become concrete, and we could advance on this pathway towards sustainable development in very concrete terms, in a meaningful way for local communities. Ellen, you maybe can also provide an overview on the activities currently being carried out with regard to wild plant harvest. So yesterday, this video, for instance, portraying different activities in the field was already mentioned, but it was not mentioned here in this audience. And maybe there are some new people here today. So I would ask you to expand a little bit on this and explain what's happening around wild harvest activities in Armenia currently.
Just briefly, because it's a pretty wide area of activity, both from the Agrarian University and Nune herself and her organization Green Lane, and now with the Green Agriculture Center. Nune, I don't know if I'm citing the name of the center correctly. This is a way where culture and nature connect, right? So this community understanding of natural resources. You have elements in many communities that recognize the importance of, it's not called sustainability in common language, but how you think about it in the long term, that you don't destroy the resource. So there's ways in which this wild harvest can be used to engage communities in sustainability thinking, because it is something that is very close to their hearts and it's very integrated in their lives. With respect to the Gates project and what we did with Wild Harvest was kind of do some research, community input, and research, public participation GIS about the areas where people go for wild harvest and trying to map that to understanding land use patterns in rural communities. But we also developed a module which is publicly available, and we will promote it properly in the next month or so, on public participation and environmental ecosystem governance. So there's several modules, and one of them focuses on public participation and wild harvest planning, and also managing in general, if you're from a policymaker or a community resource management perspective. One other thing that we have done, and Nune is one of the stars of the video, we took 5 stories, and our colleague Nelly Rafaelian developed this we structured it, and she's the filmmaker, she developed it. 5 stories of rural communities, mostly women. There's one example of a man who's doing a very successful export business with wild harvest, with a lot of women involved. Stories of how wild harvest is used in their everyday lives, and how they're integrating the concepts of sustainability in it. So one of the stories is about agri camps, educating children about wild plants, and at the same time introducing ideas of, harmonizing one's life with nature. Another one is women who are basically feeding their homes with wild harvest. Another story is, Nune with her activities of really encouraging people to think about harvest in a bigger way, and also start thinking about cultivation as an alternative to wild harvest when the demand goes up very high. And then we have Armenia Food Lab, which really takes all this traditional knowledge, rediscovers it, and then also gives it new meaning and explores new culinary directions with wild harvest. So we have these really interesting stories collected, and that will also be available. It's almost done. So these would become resources to generate discourse around nature-human connection and culture-nature dialectics. So I don't know if that's enough at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Yeah, and do you have any reflections on this?
Sorry to interrupt you. I haven't heard of those videos, and I didn't know I participate. If Nuna, you mean myself, when can it be available? When can we see those videos? Thank you.
It's being edited and finalized. But you are a key speaker. I mean, I think Nelly Rafaelian was visiting you and spent quite a bit of time with you, because there's a lot of footage. There's a pretty 6-7 minute segment on you. So yeah.
Merci, Shat.
Thank you so much.
So Jörn, you started.
Yeah, I think both from what Nuna said and Alan said, a few things really resonate with me. And I think Nuna's example, like you said, Claudia, is a really nice example of something tangible. The wild plant harvesting is a tangible issue that you can draw people in with. And I can really see how what's worked well in Transylvania was also some of the NGOs work on quite tangible things. And that's what NGOs do, and that's good. They work on tangible things and tangible projects, and projects that need to work for some farmer who participates to actually make a profit at the other end or whatever. It's very tangible things, while research organizations can come a little bit and provide bigger picture. So with exercises like the scenario planning, for example, thinking more broadly, how do these different things relate? And I think that can be a very fruitful way of collaborating. I really liked also how Nune emphasized good relations. So we play different roles here, different kinds of actors play different roles. But if we all are all oriented in broadly similar ways towards a better future, then I think it can be very fruitful to work together and not expecting everyone to do exactly the same thing, because we have different roles in this. And one thing I really liked, like aligned with that of what Alan said, was this phrase, he used the phrase, Alan, to generate discourse. And I really like that. I mean, I think we so often think we need to solve problems, but maybe before we can solve problems, we need to generate the right kinds of conversations about how to even think about the problem. Sometimes it's not the solution that is wrong, but it's even the questions that are wrong. And generating discourse around this is a really worthwhile thing as well. So I really liked both of those comments from Nune and Alan.
Thank you. And this is a perfect time to bring in Dr. Karin Manvelian also here to this round, because Jörn, you just stressed the value of NGOs being involved in this in terms of tangible projects, doing tangible things at the local level also. And this is precisely what Karin is doing since many, many years. So please welcome with me Karin Manvelian here in our round. He has a PhD in biology, was born in Yerevan, and is involved in conservation in the country since more than 40 years now. And since almost 20 years, he is the country director of WWF, so the World Wildlife Fund. And with WWF, he implemented projects mostly targeting biodiversity conservation in protected areas, but also establishing eco-corridors across the country. And although it's about protected areas, this has a lot to do with communities and community involvement and integrating different kinds of land use also, which play a role in these areas. So the question of how to involve communities, how to develop, for instance, contracts that make sense and support local activities is something where he can share experiences. So Karen, with your experiences of fostering biodiversity conservation in Armenia, what are your thoughts on the current discussion we are having here and on Jörn's keynote?
Thank you, Claudia. I would like, first of all, to thank Alan and AUA for organization of this meeting, as well as Jörn for this very interesting and deep presentation. Speaking about landscape, yeah, in Transylvania, in Armenia, also we have more or less this mosaic of different landscapes. I mean, different categories of lands like pastures, forests, hay-making lands, these cultivated or arable lands, as well as different types of ownership of these lands. I would like to say that in Armenia, state lands are mostly covered by forest and protected areas, when the rest of lands, most of the lands, are owned by communities, municipalities. And very small amount of lands are private, mostly they cover these cultivated lands. Actually, we see how these lands cover also is changing during these years because of climate change, because of this less precipitation, less water in the spring rivers, reservoirs, and actually many local people and communities suffer from this. This is definitely. And as I mentioned, we are focused on biodiversity, climate change, forest. These are our main focus areas. When speaking about biodiversity conservation, of course, all of us know that it's done usually in situ through this protected areas network. But also what to do with this biodiversity which occur in outside of protected areas. Of course, we have target to cover by protected areas 17% of the territory, country's territory. At the moment in Armenia, protected areas cover about 13%. Actually, about 3% was added through our projects, especially in the south of Armenia. Now, with assistance, financial assistance of German government, BMZ, through KfW, since 2015, we have been implementing this establishment of eco-corridor project, which is usually focused on community work. Despite work on a protected area, we also were engaged in working with the communities, but here we make at the end conservation contract with communities, with municipalities, mostly related to land use, which usually produced in participatory manner with involvement of community representatives, NGOs, other actors in that particular area, etc. For your information, maybe some of you don't know that being part of Caucasus ecoregion, Armenia is identified as one of the biodiversity hotspots by WWF and by Conservation International. And we have a regional setup in the Caucasus, and about the last ecoregional conservation plan was produced 1 year ago, where we engaged, by the way, Tigran University, scientific institutions on assessment of biodiversity. And actually, you can find it in our website or in other places, last version of ecoregional conservation plan, which shows key biodiversity areas, including protected areas, as well as this large conservation landscape. In case of Armenia, it's covered by a so-called East Lesser Caucasus landscape. And our focus in that landscape, working with protected areas or with communities who own the land outside of those protected areas. So this is our approach. And of course, about a couple of words about wild collection and harvesting. In this case, yes, it's quite obvious in Armenia, local people use a lot of these herbs. In some cases, of course, if they use these bulbs of the herbs, then they can damage. But usually we involve, again, scientists like botanists from Institute of Botany, who also provide some training for local people how and when to collect, not to damage any those plants, especially those which are red listed ones. This is kind of partnership what we made within our conservation programs with scientific society, with communities and other stakeholders. We also work closely with GIZ, with UNDP, with some other international organizations, as well as NGOs, especially within this Eco Corridor project, CBOs were established by some municipalities, and we work closely with them, actually providing some funding to them for about 10 years, and half of funding goes for nature protection issues, and half goes for some resolution of some problems in the social, mostly social problems in the particular municipality. It's a mosaic of landscape, of course, and when we produce, for example, this habitat management plan, it includes not only these pastures or haymaking land or lands owned by community, but also if there is a forest, then it is also included, because we cannot separate this land from another one. It's one habitat for example, these target species. By the way, about target species, we assess all biodiversity in those areas, but our focus are at the moment 4 mammal species. This is Persian or Caucasian leopard, Armenian mouflon, bezoar and brown bear, which is also occupying the entire country, by the way, about brown bear. But now, because of these many new protected areas and these community conserved areas created by municipalities, number of bears increased in Viotor, for example, one of our southern region, and there is now ongoing human and bear conflict. And we, of course, help the community to solve or to mitigate this conflict, providing some electric fences, for example, to cover their beehives or their orchards, as well as compensating them. This is briefly, now at the moment, we have about 37,000 hectares covered by community conserved areas in Armenia, which means it's about 1.3% of entire territory. We have a plan also to increase and to engage 10 more communities for our conservation work in the second phase of the project. And we are working at this moment with those communities, which will be, at the moment we have conservation agreements with 7 communities, unifying about 11 villages, let's say, 7 municipalities. And we plan to have 10 more in the second phase of the project. And by this, we shall cover most part of those areas which are rich by biodiversity, but still they are outside of protected areas. Of course, we understand all that we cannot cover entire country by protected areas, but involving communities in this process and making them and capacity building and other activities that they should protect their environment. It's an ongoing process, and of course, in most of cases, we have very good results. You can see now, for example, one of our, let's say, community conserved areas, and see bezoar goats every time, when 10 years or 15 years ago, it was not possible. We have all these numbers, how it was in 2006, for example, there were at the same area about 40 Bezargot. Now it's 800. Of course, if Bezargot population increased also a population of some predators, and leopards are there already, they are back. But meantime, it creates also some more problem because more bears in the area, and they because of this climate change impact as well, they started disturb villages much, which also should be considered. And I noticed in your presentation, Jorn, it was also quite a big problem as far as I understood in Transylvania. But here in other regions of Armenia, we don't have such a big population or large population of brown bear in comparison with southern part, which is a result of this existence of many protected areas, of course, protection regime, and these community conserved areas, and of course work done not only by us, but also our partners, NGOs, local communities, international organizations, and the government, of course, Ministry of Environment. This is briefly, I am ready to answer any questions in relation with it.
I would have another question, Karen. My question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to this approach of involving communities in biodiversity conservation?
In the beginning, it was not easy, honestly, while spatially planning these protected areas. We worked closely with communities, and in accordance with our legislation, they should donate this land back to the state on the establishment of new protected areas. It's quite a challenge. But through our community development projects, through these participatory planning meetings, we achieved this because we don't, for example, need this arable land or cultivated lands on the protected area, but we need those gorges or rocks which are habitat for many, many species, including this Bezargot or high mountains areas which are not acceptable for agriculture, like it's habitat for Armenian mouflon, etc. Actually, most of communities agreed to allocate those lands on the protected area. In case of community conserved area, this land ownership doesn't, there is no changes. And usually they also understand, most of communities, that they need sustainable life and sustainable use of those resources, what they have around them. And many communities now, for example, they reject to have any mining in the administrative boundaries of the communities. Recently, in the same area, in Vayodzor, there was one new project on mining. And actually, there were discussions, and our, let's say, the CBO who is managing this area, they have caretakers or communal rangers. They fixed Bezargots in that particular place, and they provided with maps, with photos, and actually it helped us to prove in front of Ministry of Nature of Environment to reject this project. And actually, this project was rejected because of it was a habitat for Bezargot, at least, which is in a red data book of Armenia. So communities now slowly understand there is another challenge, environmental challenge, because not only mining, but also these small hydropower plants, which are developing in the countries, and many communities are suffering from this because these guys put the entire water into the pipes and no water in the river, and they cannot even to use this water for irrigation. This is another challenge what we have, main challenge in case of environmental problems, let's say. And that's why communities are much more aware now, because also this Facebook, social media and everything, they're much more aware than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. And most of them are happy to have these kind of integrated land use plans in there as a guideline for them, for example, pasture management or other issues. I fully agree with Nune that they release livestock very early when this vegetation is not so well grown. And there are some problems. The use of remote pastures are lacking now, and we try to support them with some, again, with pasture management plans, some basic infrastructure that shepherds can take their livestock to those remote pastures and stay there, instead of using pastures nearby the villages where we know the degradation of lands, etc. Sorry for a long answer.
No, it's perfectly fine. Pastures, and that brings me directly to our last panelist, because she is working on pasture management with GIZ, the German International Cooperation Agency. So please welcome Lisa Hönsch with me here. Lisa is German. She studied political sciences and development geography, and also has a strong focus on sustainable agriculture from early on. She worked for some time in Tanzania, and then I think 2 years ago joined GIZ in Armenia. And here she is involved in the so-called EcoServe program of GIZ. So it's a program devoted to management of natural resources and safeguarding of ecosystem services for sustainable development. So again, trying to bring together the benefits of nature with the benefits for human beings. And Lisa, you are having a focus on sustainable management of pastures within the EcoServe program. So please share your perspectives on Jörn's talk, on the discussion we are having.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you also for this enlightening input presentation, because it was a good chance to also reflect on our project. And for me, it was kind of a relief to see that a lot of the aspects that you have mentioned, I can also see within our project. Of course, it's difficult to cover everything and to have that one holistic approach that works on everything. But at least we are also focusing on the governance. For example, we are working on the administrative and the legal framework that deals with the pastures. For example, doing a legal gap analysis, which we have finished already. And then based on this, changing specific laws to enable better pasture management, such as the law on fauna and the law on hunting and others, and also to protect biodiversity, not only related to pasture management. We are working a lot on education and awareness raising. So we have one kind of integrated expert who works both for us and for ANAU, the University in Armenia in Yerevan. And he improves and kind of upgrades different master's courses that are related to sustainable agriculture and forestry and other fields that support biodiversity relevant activities. We do awareness raising in different fields, also on energy, because this is the other fields that we're working on when I'm more involved in pasture management. And also we foster a regional exchange between the 3 countries, because we are a regional program in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And so we are enabling an exchange of experts, but also of people who are in the practical field to exchange their experiences and challenges and limitations. But I think the most important thing, and also the one thing that has the most insights in this regard, is the creation of data as a basis for our project activities. So the most important aspect for pasture management, at least, is that we work together with DLR, the German Aerospace Agency, in the and local foundations who collect in situ data in the mapping of Armenian grasslands and pastures, which does not only have one layer of, basically the land cover or the land classification, but also information on biomass, on the grassland condition, on carrying capacity, based on which then later we want to encourage and enable the communities to use this data to develop rotational grazing schemes and management plans that then will fight the land degradation, which happens both in remote and just close pastures. So this is the most important basis. But here, and this is kind of the one thing that I want to go into, because we have been talking about this a lot, and it's probably also the essence of it, I do still see lots of challenges in the way that we work with the communities, and also in the way that we can make this data usable and also understandable for communities, because even though in the beginning we go to communities and the excitement about the approach and about the project is really great, you talk to community heads and they are excited about a German agency coming and implementing something, and everyone is really positive. But then when it comes to really applying this and translating this, I still see a lot of limitations, especially because in our case, it is also difficult to kind of translate this theoretical and very scientific approach of the mapping and the maps themselves into a usable tool to have on the ground. Because just an excursus on this, the communities are working with very different data that is based on the AutoCAD format and not compatible with GIS, but that is another problem. So there are a lot of things that come with this, which means also introducing a new information system to communities that is completely new to them. And that maybe there's also a certain level of skepticism because so far they have been working with something else. And maybe so far they don't see the full extent of the benefit of this. Plus, when using this data, still there are, as Karen has already mentioned, there are limitations in the way they actually can use this data, because if they use it to really develop these management plans, still there is a lack of infrastructure. Even though many organizations have been working in this, it's really difficult to establish a sufficient level of infrastructure in the country of shepherd houses, roads, watering points, a lot of different things that are needed for the pastoralists or the shepherds to actually go to the remote pastures and to manage them in a sufficient level. So we have made the experience that it's very important to also work with the political partners. For us, that's the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Infrastructure, plus of course the Ministry of Economy, who has departments in agriculture in it, because they actually have at least the means to develop laws and to kind of create a framework in which the communities kind of see the necessity to obey and to go to implement these activities as well. Because, for example, pasture management activities, they were developed in the past. It's not that they were not there. And I think there are also a lot of communities in which they were actually applied, but still we have made the experience that only now that we are working with the ministry, and the ministry is saying, this is the situation, this is the law, you have to implement these plans, communities are actually showing the readiness to do it. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, especially with something so new as these GIS maps, the communities and the shepherds, for example, they really have to see an effect, they really have to see an impact, rather than seeing something so theoretical and abstract that is completely new to them, to really create an understanding and like a readiness to engage fully into it. And one other thought that I had on your presentation actually is that you said that when you come up with two concrete numbers of the positive impact that some measures can have, this creates kind of a not understanding, or like a limitation of understanding in the communities, because they say, how can you come up with such concrete numbers? And interestingly enough, this is the one thing that we are thinking about doing, to actually translate exactly for the communities or calculate exactly for the communities how much meat or milk can you have additionally. What is the financial impact for you, and maybe also to calculate a little bit the ecological impact that these measures might have. So I would be glad to hear your input on this, but yeah, basically this is a rough explanation of what we are doing in this regard.
Thank you, Elisa. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I will respond to that briefly. I think this was in response mainly to the question we had earlier on monetary evaluation of ecosystem services. And what I think it's a double-edged sword. So if you do what you said you would do in that project, that is definitely going to be enticing to people who go like, "Ooh, I will earn this much more," or something. Immediately makes sense, and that's presumably the rationale for why you would provide numbers like that. The risk I see is twofold. It may still be the best thing to do, by the way, right? But the risk, I think, is twofold. One, what if it's not exactly how you figured it out? And what if there are some other costs or problems, or what something you didn't think about, whatever? Then that could be problematic. And the second is, that's more what I meant earlier, is that other scientists, if you calculate the benefits of ecosystem services, maybe for tangible ones where you can say X many kilos of meat, it's quite simple. But for some things where the formulas are more contested, it could be that other scientists say, like, that's not good science, and then they come up with their thing, and then you end up debating technical details when actually you have sort of problems to solve. So it might shift the discussion towards more technical questions, and sometimes one doesn't want that. I think that's my point. So I am generally very careful. That's what I've learned about expectations management. Saying we can try this, you can try that, but it's also a different thing. You are in a position, like I'm a researcher, you need to provide things that you need to provide solutions somehow, right? So it's a different role. So I have the luxury of doing careful expectations management. Maybe you don't have that luxury.
No, not at all. And this has also turned out to be one of the problems, you know, when wrong expectations or too high expectations are created, you run the risk of losing people on the way and people thinking, okay, well, this is not gonna work anyway.
Yeah, very important topic of expectations management. We are almost at the end of our session. I would like to use the last 2 or 3 minutes or so to asking the audience, is there an important thing you want to raise here? Remark, comment, question. Now would be the time. To any of the panelists or the keynote speaker.
May I add something? Because
yes,
I thought it's going a round of questions, so I was very short. Like, I would make a short comment regarding our conversation. As you see, our panelist partners presented, and you can see that in Armenia, mostly these biodiversity conservation projects, etc., mostly implemented by international organizations. Yeah, of course, WWF or Caucasus Nature Fund did a really great job in biodiversity conservation. GIZ had many, many projects. I'm from a small city in Armenia called Dilijan, which is a touristic city, and they were implemented a lot of projects, and all of them mostly from international organizations. But my point was to integrate our universities mostly with community problems. And as Lisa said, they are sometimes very hard to translate theoretical things to the local language. I had the same difference because I was from Dilijan as a local, and there were many, many nice projects designed, but while implementing it had some problems. And there is always a complaint that academic people think that locals do not understand, don't want to accept, and there is a vice versa. So my point, it should be designed with communities. And as Alan mentioned, and for me, AUA is a very bright example for establishing and encouraging participatory methods, and also bringing together not only NGOs, academics, but also policymakers, decision makers. For me, the ecotourism conference organized by AUA, it was a very nice platform to meet all kinds of decision makers. And even during the conference, you can see this discussion among different participants, societal members, which can support to common decision-making process and participatory approach.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, Tigran. This was almost a concluding remark and a very bold call also for collaboration with the different universities in the country, researchers and communities for following up on this integrated approach. Thanks a lot. The other panelists, would you also have kind of concluding statement, something you want to highlight in the end as a kind of take-home messages for us? So Nune, is there something you want to state here?
Շնորհակալ եմ, պարզապես այնքան հագեցած էր այս ամեն ինչը, վերջում Լիզան մի շատ կարևոր
Everything was so full and comprehensive. Whatever Lisa mentioned was so very interesting. I thought I was trying to be as brief as possible, not to speak more than I should have. I didn't want to repeat what my colleague said. Nevertheless, currently in Armenia, we should start working with land degradation issues, climate change issues. She cut off. Aside from the high stress that the population is placing on the land, leads to land degradation immensely. And it is extremely unfortunate that in Armenia land degradation, we have all types of amelioration, low fertility, watersheds, all types of erosion, wind erosion, water erosion, all of them exist in Armenia. The numbers are such large that most farmers are interested in sustainable agriculture. We know very well that the foundation of sustainable agriculture is land, and the golden rule is feed, nurture the land, so the land nurtures you. Everything that lives on planet Earth, flora and fauna, are as full as they can be. Therefore, I believe biodiversity management issues, I would encourage us to look at the lower level. Today, more than 80% of the lands, we're a country that more than 80% of degraded. Armenia does not have enough lands that are necessary, and nevertheless, we are posed with severe risks. Now, the farmer is in more need of the scientists, of NGOs. They need help and support to select new sorts regarding how to mitigate the implications of the climate change. How can farming be existence when there is a drought? Farmers very often are just discouraged. They are afraid because their externalities are so severe. They think that's it, climate has changed in their village. But when you go, you talk to them, of course, in parentheses, that if you speak about the positive implications of the climate change, look, in this, you could never cultivate these species, but now you can. So we do not scare them off, but on the contrary, we try to come up with solutions and support them with these solutions to increase their efficiency, all the way up to when people call us, say, this happened, that happened, we had frost, we had hail. I say, yes, but maybe that's better. You never know. For example, your vegetables, your tomatoes, okay, there was hail. Nevertheless, now you have good harvest when there was you had tomatoes when it was the highest price. So you have a larger vegetation season now. You have shorter vegetation species now instead of the long-term vegetations. So not do we only share with them the practice of traditionally grown vegetables, but they're afraid of changes. So we support them in these changes. It is of crucial importance, not only for the farmers, but also from the members of the academia, scientists. Any change, it's called change resistance, which is so natural, isn't it? It's just an additional level of stress. So it's not like we should only think everything is so very dark and hopeless. A scientist, which conducts his or her scientific activities and on the mountains and among the hills. So this science does not benefit the results anymore. So now we should review the practices we have. We should work hand in hand with the farmers, consultation, bring all the stakeholders into discussion. So I'm more than sure that, as Tigran already mentioned, most of you mentioned, that it's only through joint results, joint activity, hand in hand cooperation, collaborations that we'll be able to face the challenges that our country is posed with. Mr. Mavalian mentioned, look at the fauna, the farmers, the small pastures in this matter. When we sit and we talk with them, they explain to us that, do you know what? We try to explain to them that by taking them to the pastures just 1 month before the necessary time, you are ruining the pasture. Or when they use their plants which are poisonous, we try to teach them, and then people are happy when they see the chamomile flowers. It's so beautiful with the chamomile flowers I lost
Thanks,
her.
thanks so much, Nune. We are running a little bit out of time, but I appreciate your statement on this joint support of changes. So supporting communities and all other actors on this pathway towards, more sustainability. So this transition idea, which we have at the center here. So as said, we are running out of time and you all want to have a break before you hopefully attend the next session. Therefore, I would ask Karen to also come to a concluding statement. Please, not more than 1 minute. I'm sorry.
Yes, of course.
I will have to ask you to be so short.
Yeah, it's important when speaking about this integrated landscape approach to bring more stakeholders. So it means partnership is a key for this. We should map, as usually we do, who is active in that particular village or place, and then of course start our program. And now I guess I know about UNE's work, I know many other NGOs, what are they doing. This is nice, and if we have those overlaps in some places, we can do more. Otherwise, one NGO or one international organization cannot do a lot. Yeah, we should bring our efforts together. It's about partnership. Thanks.
Thank you. Lisa, your final statement.
Yes, for me, maybe the one thing that very recently I could take away also as a lesson learned from our activities is that the most essential thing is to work together with everyone from the very beginning, to explain what is going to be done, to explain the kind of basis of data and then what results from it, and to make sure there's a sincere understanding and also a willingness from the side of the target group and all the partners involved, and to make sure that they have a basis to exchange from the very beginning and to create the right expectations and a common understanding for what is going to be done.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Yeah. Now it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I learned a fair bit today about Armenia, so thank you very much for sharing those things also with me. I think we can take from this indeed I would take very similar things from what the previous people have said. Partnerships, transdisciplinary approaches, that's clearly going to be vital in these kinds of things. And I would just add to that a fair bit of humility. We think sometimes we know stuff, and the more you know, the more you realize you don't really know anything and don't understand anything. And that's, I think, a very healthy thing. So the more we can approach these things, realizing we're probably not going to solve any problem, but we're probably going to find a new problem, but we're still trying to solve a problem. And somehow this is a natural and good way of doing things. We're all in it together, and together we can continue to learn.
Yeah, thanks so much. So this is a great concluding remark. So seeing this as a journey, which will not stop here. It will not stop today, since we are having another session today, but also beyond this conference. I hope that through the conference and all the other activities around it, that we will be able to create networks, collaboration, and continue on that pathway. I thank you all for participating in the session now. We will have a break now. So 4:45 Armenian time, 2:45 Central European Summer Time. We will reunite, and then we'll look more into technological aspects as connected to this integrated holistic approach of landscape management. So adoption of public participation GIS, including three-dimensional approaches, and the relevance for this in the context of Armenia and the Caucasus region. A great thank you to our panelists, Karen, Tigran, Lisa, and Nune. Thanks a lot for all your contributions. Thanks a lot to you, Jörn, for making that great start into this discussion. I'm sure you sparked a lot of thoughts. And thanks a lot to the audience.